Okay, so I'm going to do a little pre-learning and just as a way to introduce a concept that is so basic to programming and not basic in the sense of simple, just it's a fundamental thing that in programming we do. And she's going to cover it next week. And the way she covers it's kind of interesting. So I thought, you know what, the more exposure you get, the better, because it is a part of your Dev Zero, and the more experience you get with writing functions, the better, right? So all the code we've been writing so far is just basically running in sequence, right? One command after the other. So when we write functions, we take code, we place it in a structure that I'll show you, and then we call that code inside that function. And oftentimes the reasoning behind this is to make very concise commands that are definitely things that we would want to run in again and again, and also to make it more maintainable over time. So if I put a function together that basically does some kind of calculation, I can just call that again and again rather than just have to write the code. And a lot more of the reasons that you're going to learn as you further become more in depth, more experienced in programming. So we're just doing a little pre-learning, just playing around, not going to hurt anything. So, and then I'm going to, along the way, introduce you to debugging inside of VS Code. We've seen her run Thorny, which I think is fun and visually it's good. Debugging is just one of those things. The sooner you learn it, the better you can be at coding because it helps you find errors. Either maybe syntax errors are pretty clear because they show up as soon as you run the code, but logic errors of why things are not working the way you would think they would be working. So let me move over to VS Code real quick, and I have an empty main.js. And I'm first just going to show you like the syntax for a function. So if I define, so this is something we haven't seen yet, and I'm going to say, how about add two? Okay, basically add two numbers. Okay, probably not the best name, but name, one of the hardest things in programming is naming things. And then I open and close parentheses and then I put a semicolon. Okay, so then when I hit enter, now VS Code is like, okay, now what's going to go inside of this function, right? And I would say maybe A equals 100, B equals 20, right? And then I could say C equals A plus B. Okay, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Okay, but in this case, if I run my code right now, nothing happens because defining a function is great and important, but you need to call the function. Okay, okay. So now if I run it again, cool, nothing shows up still. Well, I'm not doing anything with it, right? So I'd maybe want to do print C. Okay, run it again. And I love the way, because it's always been the way I've coded, and to hear her talk about code and run and code and run, I'm going to tell you, I have found for me, I generally run my code, run my program after I write a line or two. It really depends on what I'm writing, but running and coding and running and coding and running is just a good practice. Okay, so again, we now have a function, right? And now I'm actually going to show it to you in a way that actually shows what it's doing. Okay, because you see what it's doing, you see the output, but again, the idea of taking Thorny to kind of a little more programming level technical experience. There is something in VS Code over here. And again, if you're using a different editor, feel free to play with whatever that is. And it's called Run and Debug. And when you click in here, you have this option to do Run and Debug. Now, if I just run this now, it's going to create the same output because I haven't done something really important, which is set a breakpoint. And a breakpoint is just basically like going to tell the IDE when you run this Python code, right, stop at this place in my code so that I can poke around and see what it's doing and walk through the code. So I could actually just set it right at the beginning if I wanted to see everything this was doing, right? So let's just do that. So I'm going to say run and debug. And when I do this, VS Code changes the way it looks. For one thing, we get this nice little bar at the bottom. I think just to kind of help us understand we're in something a little different here. We get a nice little interface here, a little window, maybe a little tooltip. Actually, it's beyond a tooltip because it actually has function that gives us some options. And if you just hover over, it tells you, right? So if I just wanted the code to run, right, it would just be this first one, just continue. If I wanted to jump over something, that becomes when you have more function calls. But most of the time, when you're new to this, what you're doing is stepping into. Okay, you could step out of it. You could start over, or you could end the whole thing, right? So if I just hit end right now, it would just go away and it'd be back to my regular interface. Okay, so let's do it again. Run and debug, still with my breakpoint here, right? And now I'm at the first line, so nothing has happened. And when I hit step into, interestingly enough, it jumps all the way down to the add to call to the function. So it actually jumps right down here. And that is kind of interesting because what's happening here is that by defining it, we've told Python, okay, here's our function, but it's not going to do anything until we actually call it, which is what I was saying before. So if we now, and there's actually a lot of, again, the more you use debugging, the more you start diving into some of the tools. And at this point, there's something called global or local and global. Okay. And there's some special variables inside of here, function variables. Okay. So right now there's nothing yet because I haven't executed the function itself. Okay. So again, you're just kind of playing around to see what you can kind of figure out. Right. Again, take this as more fun than anything. So now if I step into this call, now it actually goes back because the first time it came through, it was just setting up the function. And so now that I've called it, now it actually is going to step through. So again, I'm stepping into each line inside of my function. This stepped into the line to add to, so it called add to. Now it's in the first line where it's saying A equals 100. I've done that line. Okay. And what happens here, if you roll over A, you can now see what is stored in A. And that's really helpful to see. It's like, oh, yeah, that's like 100 now. You kind of know that, but to see it, it helps, right? And what happens here is if you go over to local, because what happens is when you're running things inside of a function, right, it's called local scope. And so she doesn't talk about it much yet. She will later on. But more than anything, I just want you to start kind of thinking about, right, understanding more about what your code's doing. So if I step into here, I step into here, right, it does its calculation. Now I can see I have 3 local variables inside of here. My global scope, there's the function is setting out here. Okay. I'm still inside of this function call. I'm getting ready to print. So if I step into there, I can see it's 120 and now control comes back to add to. Okay. And now I'm actually returned. And even though you don't really see it, there actually is something that got returned besides just control. And we'll talk more about that later. And I might actually kind of preview it here, but because I don't want to throw too much at you with this function, right? I just want you to know that is a very common thing that we're going to build upon knowing in this class. And if I go ahead and hit step again, then it actually is completely done executing my code, and now it gives control back here. All right, so there's things we're going to learn about return values and arguments and parameters and all those things. But for this assignment, because we're doing a little pre-learning, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find, and let's come back here for a minute, right? So look at the code that you wrote for day 3, 4, and 5, and select 2 examples that you want to. And this term refactor is very common in programming, where we take something and we refactor it. Basically, it's the same thing. We're just adding different different I wouldn't even call it functionality, because we're not changing the function. We're saying this, it does the same thing, but now it's refactored to use different commands, different practices, different design patterns. And that's what you're doing, is to use functions here, right? So, and I definitely recommend this step, which is, don't start messing around with your code up in your private. Okay, you're going to copy that code, whichever ones you decide. Like I just gave an example here, so I ended up giving the file name the day x5 exercise 5. And the reason I did it like that was so in case I messed up the code somehow, and I'm actually going to show you how to do the function in here as well. But if I did that, I could always go back and look at the original, because remember, all we're doing here is playing, right? Okay, so do that. Copy them to copy the 2 files that you want to refactor using functions. And once you have working code, then do the git workflow. Oh, I forgot that piece. And link to the 2 Python files. Okay. So let's come back here. Let's come back to let's do this one. So this is my output for the rock scissors paper, and you can remove any comments. Mine's a little different than hers, which I like that. And I notice sometimes I look at my code compared to hers, and I'm like, sometimes I think mine's better, sometimes I think hers is better. And so in this one, I got a little stubborn. I like the way I had done it, which is totally okay. But I also removed the comments and of her code example. But in this case, I could kind of think about, well, where could I put a function here, right? Now, what we're about to do is just giving you the experience of setting up functions. What you place in a function will become more clear over time, but generally, you want a clear input, a clear output, and a pretty concise, right? You don't need a lot of code. So what I'm about to do is definitely not best practice. We're just doing it to give you the experience. So let's say in this example, right? So don't use the example I'm about to show in your refactoring, okay? So let's say I wanted to take the game logic, right? Just the game logic itself, and place it into a function. And what you're going to find is some things, like this is a logical block. It's got a clear input and a clear output, right? Um, it kind of makes sense to put into a function. So I could say def game logic, right? Open close parentheses and a semicolon, right? Now, when I do that, because we've learned so much about indentation, right? That what I'd have to do, and this is definitely what you want to do, in order to make all that logic uh, available inside the function, you select it and hit tab. And what that does then is it makes it so that all the game logic is now in a function called game logic. And now, what's the other thing I have to do is I have to call game logic, open and close parentheses. Okay. So I'm just going to so this will work fine, no problem. Now, what if I had tried to put this code in a function? Okay. I just want you to think for a minute, like, would this have broken my code? Right? Because here's what's happening, and it goes back to that local and global scope. When I place the logic here, right, it has to have access to some variables. Player choice and random choice is the 2 variables, because they're created here, that I'd need access to. Okay, so when this code runs, it then looks out in what we call the global scope. And again, if you want to play around with that concept, set a breakpoint, start your debugger, say run. And it's going to ask me for I'm going to say rock, but stopping right here. Okay. So if I come over here, I see I have some global variables, player choice, random choice. Oh, look at the tie. Okay. So I also have some string variables as well. So if I tried to place this into a function, just this basic structure that we're looking at here, it'd break my code unless I did some additional function stuff. Okay. I did some things like call the function but returned a value so that I could use it later. And that's why I don't want to do any of that yet. I just want you to play around with, oh, where could I? And it could, could you have just one line in a function? Sure, you could. But doing it this way kind of helps you break your code into logical blocks of what it's doing. And if you walk away with just understanding that, you will have gotten something from this assignment. So just know you may break code. And when you break code, if you can't figure it out, we'll undo it, right? Or ask, right? Because again, if I had done def get choices here, right? And I put a return, I didn't need to, right? And again, if I just selected this and I hit tab, this would break my code. Because and by the way, I would have had to come down here, and which would I have run first, game logic or get choices? And the answer is get choices, right? And it would still ask the user for that information and it would print it out, right? But when actually, let's just see it. And actually, you can already see this. Look at this. Oh, actually, we're in the middle of, sorry, I just realized we're in the middle of debugging and I'm writing code. So it's so funny, I forgot. So let me see this. Go ahead and stop this. Does it keep? Oh, it does. I've never done that where I actually wrote code, right? Inside of here. Now, what's kind of cool here is that actually, and I have something called Pylance, which is something I'm going to be talking about, which is a way to do linting inside of your code editor, VS Code, because this actually is telling me right here that these are not defined. And you might go, well, why are they not defined? And that goes back to that idea of that if I run code, if I define variables inside of functions, right? Unless I somehow either return them from the function, which I could absolutely do, okay? I could return it single or multiple values. Or the other way I could handle this, and I'll just show you this, is I could just say player choice here, because if I set up player choice and it's going to be an int, okay, I could set it as 0, and I could say random choice. Now, why would I do this? Okay, I would do this so that when I run these functions, right, then instead of only, so before where it would have set up this variable inside of this function scope, now it's going to go, oh, that variable already exists out here, so I'm just going to update it. Okay, so if I come down here now, run this, because I first have to say, what was it? Did I say get player choice? Now I don't remember the name I gave it. And that's why, oh, get choices. Okay, get choices. There we go. Okay, now if I run this, it works. Okay, oh, it's a tie. Run it again. 2. Wow, cool. Wow. Makes me want to go look at it. That doesn't seem right. But anyway, so here's my suggestion to you. Not my task for you is to play around with functions, right? Just create some, go look at some code. Doesn't have to be anything complicated. We've done a variety of code for the days we've covered here, right? Create some functions. See if you break your code, if you can fix it. If not, back out and try something else. Also ask for help. This is a great time to start talking to other folks about and posting it out on Discord, that if you're not sure, maybe why did that break it? Right. And that's where having your code out on the public will allow other people to see it as well. Okay. So in addition to the function and the debugging, right? So for the function output, just give us a link to the 2 files that you refactored. You could also say something about how many functions you created. Again, remember, this is pre-learning. This is just playing. There's so much you're going to learn about functions, but for this exercise, I just want you to kind of see a simple implementation, and then play around with this idea of debugging, right? So this idea of setting a breakpoint, right? Hitting run and debug, and actually stepping through your code, right? So that sets up my 2 global variables. This is just being defined, get choices. These functions are being defined, then it jumps down to here. And now it's going to run back. It's going to say, okay, now I'm executing what's inside of that. And as you use this more, you start to see how your code, that's the idea, is actually working. Okay. So now, right, if I'm stopping there, it's asking the user for the choice. And you can see this, like that's 2, right? And now if I go back and roll over this, you'll see that player choices too, because what happened, again, the reason I set it up this way was so that I could use, because I need those variables inside of my logic. And you will learn the idea of passing things into functions soon. But for today, just get introduced to these concepts. Okay, so in your writing, talk about, play with debug. Play with it. The more you learn to debug something, to understand what it's doing, it will become your friend. If you've taken my JavaScript course, you know that I harp on debugging all the time because it takes your coding to a new level. All right. So I've covered both of these topics. Yeah, to get full points here, you need to provide links for the first and the second one, and in your reply, discuss any part of this work, maybe your functions, right? You want to say something about that, right? But make sure you do talk about the debugging experiences, and if that helps you understand, or just what was your experience of playing with debugging tonight? Okay, or today, or whenever you do it. And 2 replies are required and worth 10 points. All right, this is it, week 2. Hope this was fun for you. I hope you enjoyed the task that we're doing. I'll talk to you soon.